Hey everyone, welcome to an episode of Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm your host, Leslie Richardson, and today we are officially kicking off our mini series all about the new out of process extensibility model for Visual Studio, also known as visualstudio.extensibility. So, in the last episode, I was joined by Tina Shrepper, who's the engineering lead on the extensibility team, where we talked a little bit about the model, how it's evolved just within a few short years because it's a brand new thing and it's really cool, and also why people should check it out. And so now we're going to finally get more in depth about how to use that model and specifically break down sample by sample how you can implement different components for your extensions. So we're starting things out with the output window. And joining me today is Murphy from the Visual Studio Extensibility team. Hi, Murphy.
Hi, Leslie. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Doing well. Excited to talk about output window.
Me too. So, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on the team? I'm assuming the output window is one of them, but
Yeah. Not just the output window, as you'll see, it's a pretty simple extension. But it was one of my first projects on the team. I've been with extensibility for about a year now. But I've been doing a lot of work on the new visual extensibility um, API set. So excited to show off kind of the very start of what we have.
great. So, yeah, starting with the output window, why are we starting there? Like, why is this a great starting point?
Output window is a good starting point just because the sample is super straightforward and easy. Um, Only two files. It's a pretty good kind of display of the fundamentals of how to build a Visual Studio extensibility extension. It's also super common. I think most people think about writing to the output window when building an extension. It's helpful for most use cases, so it's a good one to start with.
I agree. I think no matter what you're doing in Visual Studio, the output window is like something that everybody's going to encounter or interact with at least
Yeah.
a couple times in their environment. I'd love to see this in action.
Yeah, if you wanna share my screen, I can start showing us the, sample extension. Cool.
Oh, let's do it.
Um, so I'm just gonna walk through this sample extension here. There's really only 2 parts to it. There's the entry point extension, and then there's the command itself. So what I'm showing right now is the extension entry point, which is where you'll specify basically high-level metadata and configurations about the entire extension. Um, and then the other component is a command. And a command is where we can set up the actions and configurations for a particular thing that we want to do. Um, it probably makes the most sense to start with the entry point. So let's jump there. I think what makes the most sense to start about is this item at the top, this Visual Studio contribution tag. So you will see this throughout an extension, and it's not just on the entry point. You might have noticed it's also on the command. But this is an attribute that you'll add to components within your extension so that they can be consumed by Visual Studio. And you'll add it to any class that's going to extend one of these abstract base types from the Visual Studio extensibility package. So, for example, if we click into this extension, this is coming from the extensibility library. But one of the things that'll unify this is it'll implement this iVisualStudioContribution class. So you'll see it on the command as well. If we click into command, it'll implement this iVisualStudioContribution class. So the takeaway from this is whenever you're defining a component for your extension, and you'll see here if I hover, this is extensions, commands, tool windows, document
Mhm.
types, um, all the things you want to put in your extension. You'll add this attribute and then just make sure it extends one of these base types that implement that interface. The next component here is the extension configuration. So if you're familiar with your V6 manifest designer, this is where you'll specify a lot of the metadata and configuration about your extension. So here we specify the ID, the version, publisher, some display name and description information. So this is where you'll set sort of high level information about your extension.
Cool. Are there any additional fields that you can add beyond that in your metadata? Or are those like
There are
the
some
ones?
additional fields. So if we look at the extension configuration, we can specify some metadata, but we can also specify activation constraints. So when your extension will get enabled. Additionally, you can specify whether you want to host in process. So as Tina mentioned in the last video, there are a lot of benefits to hosting out of process. But if for some reason you want to host this in the main dev end process, you can configure that here.
Cool. It's nice you have the option. And, yeah, I imagine the loading one is pretty important too, so, like, maybe it's if you're in a Razor file, then this would cause the extension to trigger, stuff like that. Or is that kinda similar?
Yeah.
So getting the
Yes, a lot of the other extensions will have similar activation constraints to specify when you want it to load, because you don't necessarily want this extension to be loaded in all cases all the time.
sure.
So having that just improves performance a little bit. This
Nice.
other item is the resource manager. So this is an object where you can just access different key value pairs of strings at runtime. So for localization or anything else uh, you might need this for. And then lastly, there's this initialize services. So in this case, there is nothing here, nothing implemented. But if you say had some services you wanted to access in your commands or at other points in the extension, this is where you would set those up and register them with this service collection. So for example, if we made this output window example a little fancier and had a service that told us what time it was in a random country in the world, that service would be implemented here, and then we could access it at a later point. But this is a fairly straightforward example, so we don't have any of that.
Mhm, makes sense.
So let's hop over then to the command, and we can see this thing in action. Again, we have this contribution tag. We're extending command. We have our output channel here, and then we have a command configuration. So in the same way that the extension configuration sort of simplifies things, like the V6 manifest designer, this is sort of your replacement for VSCT, for those who are familiar with it. You specify your placements here. So in this case, this command is going to show up as a button in the tools menu up here. And then we can specify an icon for it. But there's a bunch of other fields that you could provide. So it's different flags, shortcuts, tooltip text,
I'm
visibility,
guessing there's the list of all
stuff
these
like that.
different options somewhere too, right?
Yep. And if you look into the command configuration, it'll all be documented there.
Nice.
So next up is this initialization. So in this case, the only initialization we need for this command is to create our output channel window. So we will get the output from this views and then just create a new channel, passing in our display name, which in this case is going to be my output window. Um, and then in subsequent calls, so execute command async, when people click that button, as I'll show, we will just write a line to our output window. So fairly straightforward.
Cool, so that's, like, your main meat of regarding, like, the content of your extension right there inside the execute command method.
Yeah, every time that button is clicked, this will be what handles that command. I should comment on this disable warning. So this is still in preview, these
Mhm.
APIs. Um, and so the compiler will raise some warnings about the status of these because they're still marked as in preview. Um, but once those APIs are finalized, this won't be necessary anymore.
Cool. So, yeah, that's gonna be gone in a couple iterations.
Yeah, it'll be gone shortly. Um, I guess it could make sense. So if no more questions, I can just show you this thing in action. It's not super complex, but in the tool window, like we registered it, right? Our placement said tool window, so there it is. We'll run it, and my output window, and it was a test of the output window.
Awesome.
Incredible. Um,
I love it. Ship it.
this is it. Yeah.
That's great. Short, sweet, to the point. And,
Yep.
that's it's cool just because it clearly didn't involve that much just to be able to have something tangible for a user to interact with. Like, that was just 2 files and not that many lines of code. So, yeah, it seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, super straightforward. I think, it's fairly easy to just provide the name of the channel you want to create and then right there. It is probably worth mentioning there are a few other designated channels. Like people
Mhm.
are probably very familiar with the build channel, but we wanted to keep that separate from these APIs. So the APIs as they are today, you won't be able to write to some of these other reserved channels like build or debug.
So you can't extend the, like, existing debug channel or the build one or the GitHub Copilot one.
No, those are separate, like, the package manager, source control, those are independent. So, you can create your own channels and provide the names for that, but these channels, aren't extendable.
Gotcha. And I'm assuming is that mainly to make sure that, like, if something goes wrong with the extension, it's not negatively impacting that base channel?
I think that's part of it. I think too, just the build and debug channels are sort of special, and it wouldn't be a great experience to have a bunch of extensions sort of maybe not polluting, but, like,
Cluttering.
adding other content to this view. Yeah, cluttering it.
Well, I like it. Very simple, and I think that's how it should be since the output window is such a common part of a lot of people's day to day and probably a lot of people's extensions. And people can access this sample on the repository, right?
Yep, it's out there.
So, Murphy, thank you so much for sharing. I'm looking forward to seeing how this evolves, if any. I mean, it seems pretty fully fledged. The only thing I can imagine changing right now is just that warning label disappearing soon.
Yeah, it's, pretty straightforward and ready to use, so
Well, thanks, Murphy, and thank you, viewers, for checking out how easy it is to extend the output window. And tune in next time when we cover another episode on another API in the Visual Studio extensibility model and check out just how easy extending that is. So, till then, happy coding, y'all.